This band from LA became huge in the UK, but they are virtually unknown in the USA. How does something like that happen?
This town ain't big enough for the both of us. Entertain me, who's gonna leave?
Sparks built a career out of doing the unexpected. And the most unexpected thing they ever did was moving to the UK as an unknown pop act in the US, and earning a fan base so dedicated it was almost like a cult. They also had a massive impact on music throughout the years, influencing the likes of Joy Division and New Order, Bjork, Duran Duran, The Smiths, Depeche Mode, Pet Shop Boys, even Queen. This band and its influence on popular music is so much more important than people realise. And yet if you ask an average person in America if they know the name Sparks, they'd probably say no. They're two brothers, Ron and Russell Mael, who've been making music together for over 50 years. They're still going now, and they've always done things their own way, immediately obvious from their look. They're an American band who were determined to be like the British pop bands they loved. They had a rotating cast of supporting musicians, rarely sticking with any one lineup besides themselves. And then there's the way they always clashed with what record labels wanted them to do, leading them to work with at least 14 different record labels over the years. So where did it all start? Well, they exploded onto the UK scene in 1974 with an appearance on the BBC's Top of the Pops. Their journey there, though, is rather interesting. The brothers grew up in LA with a multicultural upbringing. Their father was Russian, their mother was Swiss, and both Jewish. The two boys showed a talent for music and performing early on. Ron was drawn to musical theory and composition and trained in classical piano. He was also a lover of film and theatre, which gave his music a touch of, well, theatre. But it was Russell that was the showman. Like Ron, he grew up watching old classics and musicals, and they were both exposed to classical music through their parents. Russell just soaked it up, especially in his voice. He developed that distinctive high tenor, almost operatic singing style. It was definitely unique, and he developed a stage presence to go along with it. But they also grew up in the 60s, an absolute golden age for music. And they soaked that up too, especially the British acts like the Beatles, The Who, The Animals, Bowie, The Kinks. To the Mael boys, they showed that you could be experimental and a bit avant-garde when you wanted to, and you could take risks and have success. In short, you could do music your own way. The two were involved in several music outfits in LA before starting their own band, which they named Half Nelson around 1967. Ron played keys and Russell handled the vocals, and they brought in other musicians to fill it out with guitars, bass and drums. Two more brothers, Earl and Jim Mankey, on bass and guitar, were instrumental in shaping their early sound, and were a fairly solid part of the studio lineup. But the live lineup was prone to shifting, as it did their whole career. They released their first album in 1971. It was self-titled, and it was a blueprint for what they'd become. A mixed bag, but in a really interesting way.
Oh, make me a wonder boy.
As usual, I can only play really small amounts of music in these YouTube videos, but I do upload special versions of all my videos on Patreon. If you fancy having a look, it's patreon.com/musicmongoose. So this album was quirky. It was catchy, melodic pop, but it also had weird little chord structures and didn't really stick to just the confines of pop. Some tracks are kind of rocky. And of course, there was Russell's vocals. They had that touch of theatre, and his lyrics were often witty and, well, quite odd. The whole thing was a little eccentric, and that was the heart of what the Mael brothers did. The album received decent critical reviews, but didn't really sell much. Manager Albert Grossman suggested a name change. Half Nelson was confusing and hard to remember. It was supposedly named after a wrestling move, which is an odd choice for their music. Their manager, Grossman, said they reminded him of the Marx Brothers and that they should call themselves the Sparks Brothers. The males met him in the middle with Sparks. Their first album was actually re-released under the Sparks name in 1972, and the original is now considered a bit of a collector's item. In '73, they released another album, A Woofer in Tweeter's Clothing. It had a similar reception to the first, good reviews, but poor sales. The brothers decided something needed to change, and they didn't do things by half. They decided that if the US audience wasn't working out, they'd just change the audience. They went on a tour of the UK, playing clubs and even appearing on BBC Two's Old Grey Whistle Test, a similar show to Top of the Pops, but aimed more at emerging bands rather than chart toppers. And they started to create a buzz for themselves. They were on TV and had an underground following in the UK. And this got the attention of Island Records, who saw some potential in their music for a UK market. They sent them an offer. They'd give them a recording contract if they moved to the UK permanently, and the offer was only extended to the Mail brothers, not the rest of the band. The boys didn't hang about. They sold their stuff, moved to London, and signed the contract. That's a seriously gutsy move for a pretty much unknown young band. We were kind of too young and naive to know how much pressure we actually should have been in at that time. They didn't even take any songs with them. They completely started from scratch, which marked one of the many key changes in their sound. They were accepting of all our eccentricities. They just thought it could be a little more aggressive sounding. Another key change was the lineup. The males had to find new bandmates, so they turned to the time-honoured tradition of posting an ad in Melody Maker magazine. They found the necessary members, and all of a sudden, Sparks were 3/5 British. Martin Gordon on bass, Adrian Fisher on guitar, and Dinky Diamond were an integral part of the UK sound shift for Sparks, and they set about writing a new album, which would become their breakout. Kimono My House dropped in 1974 and was a new version of Sparks. Producer Muff Winwood, brother of Steve Winwood, had helped them to focus their ideas and shape them into something for the UK market. They still had their signature witty lyrics and art pop hooks, but now they had touches of glam rock, which was big at the time in the UK. And the classic Mail brothers quirks were still there in full force. They made a good songwriting team. Ron wrote almost all of the lyrics, with a few notable exceptions from Russell, who wrote classics like Pineapple and Gone with the Wind. Mine only ever come around every 10 years. They're generational. Ron also handled the musical compositions and generally made interesting sounds, especially his signature off-kilter keyboards. They often ran against the grain, but they really worked. Russell focused on what he did best, being a charismatic singer and frontman, but he obviously had a hand in writing the songs themselves as well. They had a set structure. Ron would write these clever, interesting songs, and then Russell would come in and put his personality all over it. And Muff also helped guide them in song selection. In fact, he advised that This Town Ain't Big Enough for Both of Us should be the lead single. The brothers felt one of the safer tracks would be the better choice, but Muff stuck to his guns. That's the strongest musical statement, and then whatever happens, happens. He was right, and we were so lucky to have been around at that time when there were people like that that wanted to be brave about those things and had a passion for music that was challenging but also a part of pop music in general.
This town ain't big enough for both of us. Hesitate me, who's gonna lead?
And Muff was absolutely right. The single went to number 2 in the UK charts and helped propel their album to number 4. They went on TV again, this time in Top of the Pops. Actually, they went on twice, once in May 1974, when This Town was just released, and again a month later, when it had smashed to number 2. In fact, between 1974 and 1975, they appeared on Top of the Pops 10 times. And this was a really big deal. At the time, Top of the Pops was one of the main music outlets in the UK. It was broadcast straight into millions of homes right after dinner time. If you were on Top of the Pops, you were seen by the British public. And Sparks were hard to miss. I mean, look at them. They had quite an image. Ron in a shirt and tie, slicked back hair and a Charlie Chaplin mustache, standing there almost immobile behind his keys and almost glaring out at the audience. then Russell was a complete counterpart. He was all curly hair, brightly coloured suits, flailing arms all over the place. They were like two sides of the same coin. It was so striking that a certain John Lennon, watching at home, called his mate Ringo and supposedly said, "You won't believe what's on television. Mark Bolan is playing a song with Adolf Hitler." Now, I should say that quote isn't well substantiated, but it is widely reported. I just like the idea of John saying that over the phone to Ringo. It makes me laugh. And so, through this really ballsy move, a couple of brothers from America had become one of the most exciting pop bands in the UK. But perhaps more importantly, other bands and artists began to take note. It can't be understated just how influential these guys were. Their mix of theatrical falsetto and deadpan irony deeply influenced the art rock DNA of music at the time, proving that pop music could be both catchy and intellectually eccentric. They released another album that year, Propaganda, and another in 1975, Indiscreet. That 1974 year is considered a classic Sparks era, when they were at the height of their pop art and glam days. But they weren't ones to stick to things. As the years went on, they kept on releasing albums, kept on changing their sound. The lineup continued to rotate. They changed labels and they changed genres. In 1979, they did number one in Heaven with a different record label and a different producer, a certain Giorgio Moroder. And this marked a pivot into the electronic disco world and heavy use of synths and sequencers. It actually polarised their fan base. Some preferred the glam rock thing, but that's always the case with change. For others, it cemented them as true musical pioneers. It was also their first big hit in the US, hitting 13. In fact, Sparks basically invented the synth-pop duo blueprint. By swapping guitars for sequencers, they paved the way for Pet Shop Boys, Depeche Mode and Erasure. However, they never truly made an impact in the US as they did in the UK. But why is that? Well, think about the musical landscape at the time. Britain in the 70s and early 80s really embraced clever theatrical pop in a way that America didn't. Bands like Roxy Music and 10cc and the Kinks and XTC all thrived on literate, witty, sarcastic, ironic songwriting. They also slotted right into the theatricality and over-the-top personas of the British glam scene. Bands like T-Rex and Slade and Sweet and Mud and David Bowie. Sparks was a perfect fit, but American audiences had different tastes. In 1994, in true Sparks fashion, never to stay in the same genre for too long, they changed it up again, trying their luck in the Euro dance and house boom. Gratuitous sax and senseless violins, absolutely fantastic name by the way, was massive in Germany in particular. And they just kept going and going and going. Honestly, over 50 years and 26 albums, it's hard to cover everything, but they always did it their way. Russell once told an interviewer that they have a hostility towards taking a boring approach. And it's obviously true. But through all their changes, they always kept what was intrinsically Sparks. That humour, the oddness, the fun of everything. They just always did it their own way. In fact, in the 80s, their label, RCA Records, was urging them to make simple pop songs that you can dance to. So, frustrated by this, Sparks bluntly called their 1986 album Music That You Can Dance To, and left the label not long afterwards. And that pretty much sums them up. That wasn't the first or last time they clashed with a label either. Later in their career, they ended up mostly using small independent labels, which gave them much more freedom in their art. What's funny though, is that they still never really gained huge commercial sales in the US. They just didn't get it. And even now, they're still going, with no plans on stopping. They still tour to this day, and even released an album in 2025 called Mad. They're often known as the best band you've never heard of, and that really reminds me of another band, a British band this time, super influential on British music, practically invented a whole genre, but not a lot of people know the name. Strawbs. I've done a video on that band too, click over here for that next.